Queen Matilda of Flanders, overshadowed by her more famous granddaughter of the same name, was atypical for a woman of her time. She had immense sway, refusing to be cowed by her often violent Norman husband. She was more than just the wife of the conqueror. She was one of the most influential and powerful women in Europe. And this is her story. The year is 1066, and Normandy is gearing up for the invasion of England to wrest the crown from the usurper Harold Godwinson. A huge fleet of ships, along with the flagship, the Mora, was docked just south of Calais at the mouth of the River Somme, while his army was camped at Saint-Valery-sur-Somme. It would have been an awesome sight to behold. Only the turbulent weather that was occurring this year, caused by the low pressure in the Atlantic, raised any sense of doubt in the upcoming invasion. Storms and winds could change at any given moment, and the Normans were no stranger to ships being lost in storms on the journey to St. Valery, so they understood the need for the weather to change. As for the political situation surrounding the invasion, Matilda would have understood the situation perfectly. She knew that England had been weakened by an uprising and was ripe for an invasion. She would have studied her husband's plans and weighed up the odds. Already fully engaged in the Norman propaganda machine, Matilda was rallying troops and calling on oaths, even giving up her daughter to the church. And the Pope had given her husband a papal banner. Still, there was more preparation to be done as William's army grew. And he would have had forces from Flanders and was expecting them, yet Matilda's father, Baldwin, didn't send any aid. Okay, this was no doubt because the Count of Flanders had a conflict of interest. You see, Tostig, who had been expelled in the aforementioned uprising, was married to Baldwin's half-sister. This meant that he had family obligations, and he was asking Baldwin to support him. Tostig had no love for his brother, Harold Godwinson, and the newly crowned English king had driven Tostig out of England, forcing him into exile. Now Edwin and Morcar ruled the north. So Tostig wanted revenge, as well as his lands back, and had thrown his lot in with the King of Norway, the Norseman known as Harald Hardrada, another contender for the throne. Prior to this, Tostig is said to have actually approached William, but the Duke thought him a liability, sent him away. Now he was Hardrada's problem. So if you were Baldwin of Flanders, what would you do? You owe allegiance to two men who want to invade England, Tostig and William. What's more, Baldwin was also on good terms with France, who opposed William and his campaign. He really was in a pickle. However, Baldwin would eventually capitulate and give William military support. But only when the Duke offers him 300 marks of silver a year, a sizable sum, and easily affordable should William conquer England. What William didn't know was that Baldwin was hedging his bets, also giving Tostig military support, playing both sides, and the rotter. There was also Brittany, where Conan II had given it a bit of Harry the Pickle in the previous year. In short, William needed to make sure his Norman domain was secure in his absence, and the last thing he needed to do was to wrest England from whoever's in his way, and then find his enemies have counter-invaded and taken Normandy. So Duke William needed to put Normandy in safe hands, to the commander he trusted the most. And this was expected to be his son, Robert Curthose. But no. The Duke handed the domain to none other than his wife, Matilda. In his absence, she'd act as regent. But should we be surprised? Well, no, not really. Matilda was a competent woman who fully understood politics and how domains should be run. While Robert was 14 years old, and although an adult in this day and age, he was a bit of a spoilt brat. There was no way the Duke was going to leave Normandy in the hands of his son. He was a mummy's boy, and he would stay that way, under her command. And Matilda loved Robert, her eldest son, and this only strengthened their relationship. I'll also add that even though women were growing up quite powerful during this period, and Matilda being made regent was quite a rare occurrence, and only stands as testament to her abilities and character. And even her idol, Emma of England, was denied being made regent when Canute died. Other women had been made regent, but only on the death of their husbands, and William was far from dead. So here was Matilda, given all powers of the state, from charters of law to the military. So just imagine that, a control freak like William, who's already a feared military commander, entrusting the army to his wife. And the best military commanders were joining William on the invasion campaign, though William would leave her with good advisors. And no one really knew for sure if William would even win against Harold, or even come back alive. Then, in these highly superstitious times, there came an omen in the April of 1066. You see, astronomers on both sides of the channel had seen a portent in the skies, a three-tailed star. It remained in the skies for 15 days. What they were witnessing was the object we know today as Halley's Comet. In an age without telescopes, it would have been observed by the naked eye, and they would have had no idea as to its true nature, and they only saw it through the lens of superstition. Astrologers interpreted the omen as a sign of great change, something to be feared. By July, the Norman army was assembled and ready to sail. The military camp at Saint-Valery-sur-Somme was sizable, but it is not truly known how large the force was. It could be anywhere from a lowly 7,000 to a whopping great 50,000. More likely it's around 10. Same went for the ships. The 3,000 boasted may have been between 500 to 1,000. Still, this is a good turnout, and Harold Godwinson would have no doubt been keeping up to date, with fresh news coming in with each passing week. My personal guess is that the exaggerated size of the force was born out of the propaganda of the time. 50,000 troops and 3,000 ships would have reached King Harold, an army of biblical proportions. After all, we've seen how propaganda works in the theatres of World War I and II, where homeless drunks were dressed up as officers with papers to complete their deception. A cat and mouse game of intrigue, We already know the Norman propaganda machine was in full force by 1066. Whatever the case was, the muster was complete and William was ready to commence his invasion. But first, he needed to make sure that all his magnates understood fully that Matilda would be regent in his absence. So he summons a council at Bonneville-sur-Tour and got everyone to swear oaths on two conditions. Firstly, Robert Curthose was made heir to Normandy, should his father die. Secondly, Matilda was regent and would have full powers in doing so. Once this was sworn, he appointed 3 of his most trusted magnates to aid her in council: Roger Beaumont, Roger de Montgomery, and Hugh d'Avranches. The latter, Hugh, was only around 20 or so. This was Matilda's council going forward. People she trusted, men from high noble stock, the cream of Norman aristocracy. And she no doubt worried about their loyalty with William gone, as well as other possible problems from places like Anjou, Brittany, and of course France. While her husband was away, Matilda knew she would have to keep her wits about her at all times, especially with the danger faced over the Channel in England. For King Harold had not been idle. He'd amassed a large army, both sea and land, in readiness for the Norman invasion, knowing that the Duke was waiting for the right winds to carry his ships to the English shores. The Saxon king even had a fleet just off of the Isle of Wight. His army mustered, Harold waited. As far as Harold Godwin was concerned, the only rogue element in the defence of England came from his brother Tostig, for the exiled scallywag had previously amassed a fleet of ships and had begun pirate raids along the east coast. This was one of the reasons why he had been driven out of Northumbria by Edwin and Morcar in the first place. This is why he's in exile. Harold knew his brother was in Norway, plotting with the Norseman Harald Hardrada, who also cast green eyes on the English throne. Hardrada considered himself the rightful heir through King Canute. So 3 men were vying for the throne of England. So let's continue with our tangent, because we will return to Matilda. But there are events that need to be explained. And you don't think I was going to deal with 1066 and miss out all the battles, did you? Never! So, we'll deal with the conflict, then return to how Maud was running affairs back at home. Right, anyway, that summer, Harold Godwinson's fears were realised when his brother Tostig invaded the north of England with a sizable army, swiftly seizing territory and opening his war against Edwin and Morcar. The war for the crown of England had begun. Still, Harold Godwinson was satisfied that Edwin and Morcar could contain and defeat the threat, so his army remained in the south, awaiting William's own invasion. Anyway, back in Normandy, William still waited for the winds to change. Bad winds could wreck his fleet or even send it off course, and it had to be a good wind, one that could carry his ships across swiftly. So William waited, and waited, and waited. Summer passed, and autumn set in. Around this time, apparently, the Normans caught an English spy, hinting at espionage. There would certainly have been spies on both sides, as the two armies faced off over the Channel. There may have even been a possibility of a small naval clash, as several sources mention the battle around the sea between the Normans and the English. And Harold Godwinson did have a fleet stationed at the Isle of Wight, ready to counter any move that William made. But these sources could easily have been mistaken ships coming from places like Flanders, as they were sailing to reinforce William's fleet. Like usual, we don't know. And we don't even know for sure that there was any bad weather. Not for certain. And some historians claim that William deliberately held his army back until the very right moment. Now, I disagree with this, as the army that Harold was holding William at bay with was disbanded on the 8th of September. There was ample time for the Duke to invade around now and take Harold unawares, yet they didn't because of the weather. It is folly to set sail in a tempest. Yes, sure, you had the threat of the Norse from the north, but that is the north. William is invading the south, and he simply didn't fear Hardrada. And he already considers Tostig worthless. And we all know that the Channel can be prone to bad weather. William knew that he couldn't afford to lose a single ship. So I side with William of Poitiers, the chronicler of 1066, who we get most of our information from. Sure, he writes from the mouth of the Norman propaganda machine, and I'm certainly not unplaying that factor. But it's not fanciful to say that the Norman fleet had a lot riding on this, and weather was far more important than landing on a precise day. When it came to dates, there was wiggle room. When it came down to weather, there was not, as Harold had already disbanded his army and was given William no reason to postpone other than storms at sea. We cannot pick and choose when we listen to chroniclers. To me, the argument that the troops simply wouldn't remain at camp for the best part of 2 months is for the birds, as anyone that understands military manoeuvres would be familiar with hurry up and wait. Just look at D-Day. On the 20th of September, over the Channel, and in the north of England, the first of the 3 major battles was fought, when Tostig utterly defeated the forces of Edwin and Morcar at Fulford, driving them from the field, and then he marched his army onto York, capturing the ancient city. This now cleared the way for the next full-scale invasion, as the ruthless Norseman known as Harald Hardrada landed, solidifying Tostig's victory. The north now belonged to the Norwegian king. Back in Normandy, William and Matilda had a problem, and it wasn't just the weather. As for the troops, were growing dissatisfied with this idleness, and many considered God to be against the invasion. So, the Duke summons forth the remains of St. Valery, and this is the monk St. Valery who founded the local church, not the martyr who carried her own head. Different Valery. Once the troops could see the holy relics, their doubts soon subsided. According to contemporary sources, soon after the relic of St. Valery was displayed for all to see, on the 27th of September 1066, the winds did change in the favour of William during the night, and wasting no time, the order was given to set sail. The horn blew from the Morra, the Norman flagship, and a lantern was lit as a beacon for all the other ships to follow. And in a whoosh of spray in the darkness of autumn, the fleet crossed the Channel. All of a sudden, Matilda was the ruler of Normandy. Until her husband returned, that was. It must have been nerve-wracking for her. In the matter of days, maybe weeks, she'd either be crowned the Queen of England or driven off back to Flanders as a widow. Matilda headed straight for Notre-Dame-des-Prés, a Benedictine priory in Valmont, not far from Rouen. She founded the abbey a short while ago on the banks of the River Seine. There she prayed, like before when her husband had fallen ill that time. Only this time she could not be by his side. And her only link to the progress of the Norman war machine was the occasional letter. There was not much else she could do. The whole of Normandy rested on William defeating Harold Godwinson. So as far as Matilda was concerned, and many other women, prayer was all they had left. And she soon would receive news that Duke William had landed at Pevensey Bay safely on English shores, and the Saxons were nowhere to be seen. The reason was simple. Harold had disbanded his forces, confident that the winds still prevented the Normans from landing. But the news reached him that the King of Norway, Harald Hardrada, had invaded the north. So Godwinson marched his forces to meet them in battle, abandoning the south. And on the 25th of September, he met the Norwegian forces at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The battle was quick and bloody. Around 10,000 Saxons descended upon the Norsemen, who were caught completely by surprise. They hadn't even had a chance to prepare or don armour. Only the heroics of a solitary man who held the bridge, blocking the Saxon advance, allowed the Norwegians any chance of regrouping and getting back into the fight. But one of the Saxons managed to get under the bridge and thrust his spear up, mortally wounding the man. And once he fell, the Saxons poured over the bridge. Hardrada must have watched his forces be completely swarmed by the Saxons, who battered the Norse shield wall. Then, after a few bitter hours of struggle, the Norse shield wall began to falter, then crumble. Harald Hardrada fought like a lion, taking down many a foe, but was felled by an arrow to the neck. Outflanked, outmanned, and their king fallen. The Norsemen took to flight, routed from the field, a slaughter. The second major battle in the conflict had been played, a victory for the Saxon king. Among the slain was Harold's brother, Tostig, who had fought to the very last. Yet victory celebrations would not last, as only 2 days after this decisive battle, Harold learned that his main adversary, William, Duke of Normandy, had landed in East Sussex. His forces had advanced to Hastings. Consolidating his invasion force, William had taken an old Iron Age fort and used it at his headquarters. The Normans began ravaging the landscape, harrying Sussex, taking much-needed supplies, We do not know whether this mother and child perished in the fires or escaped, but it gives you an idea of what was going on. William's destruction was brutal, and this draws Harold out. I will dispel at once a myth that Harold immediately rushed his forces south and were exhausted, having just fought Hardrada, as the Battle of Stamford Bridge was fought on the 25th of September, and William didn't meet Harold Godwinson until the 14th of October. That's well over 2 weeks. So it is clear that Harold rested his forces at York following this victory. What we do know is that upon leaving York, Harold first arrives in London in early October. Again, like with the Norse, Harold was swift, most likely using horsemen to arrive early, and letting the troops catch up. They'd soon arrive at the town of Battle. Chances of that! Seriously though, they arrived at the town of Battle on the 12th of October at the latest. Hastings was just 7 miles away, and the Norman camp was spread out over the landscape. If Harold thought he'd catch William with his trousers down, like he did Hardrada, he had another thing coming. The Norman Duke was fully prepared, having anticipated this very move. Reports from scouts informed William that the Saxons were on the march, and now the Norman army had been up all night, most likely tired. When dawn broke, the order was given for the Norman war machine to march towards the enemy camp. This time, it was Harold Godwinson that was caught unawares. At this time, the Saxons, denied the element of surprise, were unable to repeat the same tactic of slamming their might into the enemy lines. Instead, were forced into a defensive position, choosing a hill to gain the high ground, Senlac Ridge. On top of this hill, and fighting on foot, the Saxons deployed their famous shield wall, a tightly knit formation that would hopefully wear down the Normans as they struggled up Senlac Ridge. The army was made primarily of local militia, but the nobility would have supplied the housecarls, elite troops with the best weapons and armour. Harold's dragon banner waved high for all to see. The Norman army was vastly different. They had heavily armoured knights with shields, lances, that specialised in punching through ranks. They had archers, crossbowmen, plus the obligatory bulk of militia. Far more tactically diverse, and this allowed William to control the battle. Many lives were lost this day, which was the 14th of October 1066. According to William of Poitiers, there was a great slaughter on both sides, as the two armies were locked in battle. The fate of the kingdom rested on the outcome of this brutal melee. The archers were ineffective, having to fire uphill against the shields, so were held back in reserve while the bulk of the fighting played out, with the cavalry weighing in when the press proved too thick. The Saxons had become rigid in their defence, while the Normans showed mobility, having room to manoeuvre, pressing the attack against the stout shield wall. It would seem that the Norman commanders were intent to prevent the Saxons from turning the fight with one of their famed master swords. William led from the front, as he always did, charging his knights into the thick of battle. Though it is clear that at other times William had retreated to the rear to analyse the situation and conduct his men. But the battle raged on. It lasted most of the day. When his horse fell beneath him, William's men began to waver, but the Duke managed to rally them back to the fight, lifting his helm, showing he was alive. Rage and fury drove him on, and William would lose 3 horses that day. Overall, the battle wasn't going well for the Normans, and the Saxon shield wall still held, the Dane axes of the House Carls cutting down any who came close. The Norman strategy needed a rethink, so the order was given to retreat. Not a rout, a ploy, a trick. This lured out the Saxons, eager to press their opponent, only to face the wrath of the Norman counterattack. Arrows poured in and knights charged. The bodies began to pile up on both sides as the Saxons fought on. Then Harold fell. It is hard to ascertain just how he was slain, as some of the legends that have been passed down claim he was felled by an arrow to the eye. But other contemporary sources say he was cut down by the Norman knights. As you can see, the words Harold, Rex, and this is above the chap who's getting hit in the eye. But it could also be depicting a scene. It could be depicting him getting hit in the eye, then getting mowed down and cut down by the knights, because you can see the chap being cut down by the knights. Although that could also just be a housecarl on one of his household knights. Like usual, we absolutely do not know for sure. But morale broke almost instantly, and men began clawing their way off the field of battle, their flight carrying them to nearby woodland in the hope of outrunning their pursuers. Others, with nowhere to run, turned around to face the Normans in one last, final stand at the ravine now known as the Malfosse. And these Saxons would meet their end, weapon in hand. News travelled fast. Matilda was still at the Abbey in Valmont, where she received a highly biased account of her husband's victory, one that told of Saxon cowardice and Norman honour, typical of the propaganda of this period. But more importantly, Matilda received news that she was now the Queen of England. She renamed the abbey the Notre Dame de Bonne Nouvelle, Our Lady of Good News, for this was good news indeed. And Matilda wasted no time in promoting her husband's success, as well as her own elevation to queen, and immediately set about Normandy, making a series of public gestures, visiting churches, donating lavish gifts, thanking every priest and every prayer spoken for her husband's victory across the Channel. The Duke, who'd, as the propaganda went, had taken back his kingdom from a Saxon usurper. The crown was his by right. In a poem written soon after in the Carmen de Hastings de Prelio, William is even akin to Julius Caesar. But the master stroke, according to legend, had yet to be struck. Matilda's legacy, the Bayeux Tapestry. One of the most famous pieces of propaganda in European history. Around 70 metres of embroidered cloth, silks, telling the story of William's victory from the Norman perspective. It reinforced the claim that William was the rightful king and Harold but a usurper. Matilda and her ladies painstakingly threading every seam and every loop, creating the famous artifact we are now familiar with. After all, she was an accomplished seamstress, and this sort of thing had occurred before, just not on this scale. But how much truth is there to this story? Because this is the story told time and time again. It's the one we'll remember. It's the one you see when you visit the tapestry itself. There are even hotels and things named after Matilda for this. But all this was first mentioned by Bernard de Fauchon when he rediscovered the tapestry in 1724. Yes, 1724. But was he right? Did Queen Matilda and her ladies really spend long hours weaving this embroidery? Or is it just another myth created later in time? It is certainly fanciful, and many doubts have risen over the years as to Matilda's involvement in this, even going back as far as the 19th century. For a start, she did not have the time. Matilda was regent for just over 2 weeks, for the duration of the Norman invasion, and ended when William conquered England. Her first act upon learning of the victory was embarking on a tour of all the churches giving donations, and was most likely far too preoccupied to sit around weaving. Matilda is a woman who was seldom idle, a master of statecraft, the Regent of Normandy, and yes, still the Regent of Normandy technically, because yes, her husband has become king, but there's still much work to do, and she has many responsibilities back in Normandy. There were still enemies on the borders who needed a reminding of William's power. And modern scholars shed further insight into the tapestry. For a start, it appears to have been created in England. It used the Anglo-Saxon style. It uses English names rather than Norman. Moreover, even William of Poitou, who hated the English, told of the legendary ability of the Saxon women to be able to weave gold. Such was their skill in embroidery. Saxon women that would no doubt have lost husbands in the battle. How many tears were shed while weaving this? Did they support or oppose the Normans? We do not know. So, if it wasn't Matilda, then who? Well, these days, the finger points at Odo, the fighting bishop of Bayeux. He's quite the scallywag, and in 1067, he'll become the Earl of Kent, once the dust of conquest has settled. Okay, a quick brief of the situation in Kent, because a lot is going on post-conquest. Currently, the Archbishop of Canterbury is Stigand. He's opposing William and aiding the rebels in the north, Edwin and Morcar, who we've met earlier. These rebels are rallying around the young Edgar Atheling, who has a claim to the throne via Edward the Confessor. They are trying to place the crown on his head. Right, soon Stigand will be replaced by Lanfranc, the Bishop of Saint-Ouen, and he's also the chap who once opposed William's marriage until persuaded. With a new archbishop comes a new cathedral, after the previous one was destroyed in a fire, that is. In 1070, just 4 years after the conquest, the foundation stone of Canterbury Cathedral is placed. It is thought that the tapestry began here in Kent, using local women to create the embroidery. And Odo was also building his own cathedral at Bayeux around the same time, at Bayeux Cathedral. So he's got connections to people in both Bayeux and Kent. He's named 3 key bishops in the tapestry, including himself, portrayed in the thick of fighting. And it certainly puts him in a good light. It's quite the puff piece. So it is suggested he's commissioned the tapestry to decorate his own new cathedral. It makes sense. Moving on from the tapestry, Matilda's tenure as regent was over, as her husband was victorious overseas. Yet, he was not heading back to Normandy anytime soon, as there was still a lot to do in England. He still intended to march onto London and take the city, as the English were rallying around this new contender, Edgar Atheling. A conqueror's work is never done. This meant Matilda got to keep her position a little while longer, which I can imagine her appreciating. The English were also rising up in Winchester, rallying around Harold's sister, Queen Edith, the widow of the old confessor. London soon fell, as did the south, as William laid the land to waste. Winchester gave little resistance. By December, Edgar Atheling met William in Berkhamsted, surrendering any claim to the English throne. Oh, and remember Conan II of Brittany, the man who was absent from the conquest? In December of 1066, Conan II is at war with Anjou, when he suddenly falls dead, and not a sword had touched him. So what killed him? Well, his gloves were said to have been laced with poison, and the finger pointed at William. Maybe because he didn't uphold his end of the bargain, failing to accompany the Normans during the invasion of England. Conan's excuse? The Normans poisoned his father. Though I do wonder if Mabel of Belim has anything to do with this. After all, she's got quite the reputation for poison and murder, even at this point in time. Yes, she's quite the nasty character. William's claim to power was now uncontested. In just a couple of short months, he'd crushed the English and put down a number of rebellions. Now he needed to finalise this victory by having a coronation, a lavish affair. He decided that this would not be complete without the presence of his wife Matilda, and plans for her to sail across the Channel were put in place. She would soon be crowned the Queen of England.